Welcome everybody. We are like 2 minutes ahead of schedule, but it's like standing room only, so we should get started. Why not? Thank you all so much for coming. My name is Leah Stokes, and this year I've been at the Radcliffe Institute at Harvard working on a book about the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a lot of fun. And this is pretty much the best way I could possibly imagine ending my year, with basically my favorite people on the panel with me. These are some of the people who had, a huge role in actually making the Inflation Reduction Act pass. So let's all talk. And I would be remiss if I didn't thank Jim Stock, who not only helped this panel come together at the Slaughter Institute, but also helped me spend the year here by also allowing my partner, Madam Mildenberger, to spend the year at the Slaughter Institute. And also to Madam Mildenberger for saying, you guys should do a panel on this and allowing us all to get together. So really appreciate that. I want to just take a couple minutes here to introduce the panel. You probably know a bunch of them. But I'll just go very briefly down the line here. Sonia Aggarwal is the CEO at Energy Innovation, and she previously worked at the White House in the Climate Policy Office as a special assistant to the president, where she worked on the IRA and also led the country's development of our NDC, a very ambitious goal globally. Jade Begay is currently an independent advocate on environmental justice and a member of the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. And she previously worked at NDN Collective for 5 years, including as Director of Policy Advocacy. Again, she advocated very importantly for the passage of the IRA. And I want to introduce Adrian Deveny, who is the founder of a new consulting organization called Climate Vision. He previously worked for Majority Leader Senator Schumer, where he really led the Majority Leader's negotiation on the IRA, along with other colleagues who will want me to say, but personally I feel like Adrian was absolutely critical to getting these things across the finish line. And finally, my dear friend, well, they're all my dear friends, Sam Ricketts, who is the co-founder of S2 Strategies, and he previously co-founded Evergreen Action, which you may know was one of the really important outside groups pushing for the passage of what eventually became the IRA that grew out of Governor Inslee's presidential campaign, and he's a longtime staffer for Governor Inslee. And I just want to say that if I were to describe these people, all of them have done more than their fair share to cut carbon pollution. They could all go into retirement, go out to pasture. They don't quite look old enough for that, but they could, knowing that they have done more than their fair share to make a difference on this planet. But the interesting thing is that none of them are doing that. They're all continuing to work towards progress, and in that way I would like to say that they're all what we would call a bodhisattva. If you know this concept, it comes from Buddhism, and it's this idea that somebody who becomes enlightened, they could just, exit the wheel of samsara, not come back, not get reincarnated. But they choose not to. They say, I'm going to work for the benefit of all beings. And that is what these 4 people are doing. They're still dedicated to making progress, even if they're tired, even if they're sick of fighting with one another, even if they feel like maybe they could have just played music or been an artist or done 15 other things. And so for that, I'm very, very grateful. And so I'd like to ask the first question to the panel. What we're doing here today is talking about what is the agenda post-IRA. And we have been able to get an unprecedented amount of climate action as well as environmental justice investments passed through the Inflation Reduction Act. There were good parts of that, there were bad parts of that, and then there was also this other law, what we often call the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or the IIJA, that also had some good parts in it too, and some bad parts too. I'd like to ask you all, maybe starting with Sonia, why do you think we were able to make so much progress during this time period? How did we manage to get, perhaps at the end of the day, if we're so lucky to keep the policy in place, we'll be spending like $1 trillion on climate federally. Why do you think we were able to do this?
Thank you, Leah, and thank you so much to everyone for having us here. And it's just great to see so many friends' faces in the audience and up here with me. So thank you again for everything that all of you did to get the law across the finish line, including, may I add, very much so, Dr. Stokes right here did an incredible amount of organizing to make sure that this law was as impactful as it could be for the climate and for people. So I'm sure we will all have answers to this question, and boy do we live in a complex and interlocking, interwoven world, right? So I don't think there's one thing that made it possible this time, but I think there are 2 things that may be worth highlighting here. One is really just the upwell of public support for bold climate action that came in the last presidential election cycle. It really was a time of inspiration, of unity, of coming together, of believing that we can do something big together when we join forces. And I think that that's just an incredible power that we all have and that people can continue to turn back to and find again. And I think that's one big reason. Another reason, I think, is that this approach was different than the approach that had been taken for a very long time. And part of that is, of course, because it had to be fit into this bizarre reconciliation framework, which is a lot of spending. But the other aspect of that means that everyone could really see how they could benefit from something like this, right? This was going to be money being injected into the system to help people cut their energy bills, to help people make sure that their lives could be a little bit easier, that we could create really good jobs, that we could build a lot more manufacturing and a lot more economic development here in the United States. And I think that was really inspiring to people, that it was a moment to act on climate. We saw a ton of energy for that moment, and then there was also just that substance of, even if climate wasn't your number one issue, there was something in there for you, and there was you could sort of see that there was going to be a positive impact of this set of policies, even if climate, again, wasn't right at the top of your list.
Jade, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think we're all going to probably just build on each other's responses, but I agree. I think it was not just one thing or one silver bullet, but rather just even acknowledging the multiple grassroots efforts happening years before. So I was writing down how the No DAPL movement, inspired all this leadership. Deb Haaland was somebody who was at the No DAPL camps back in the day. AOC says she was motivated to run for Congress at the No DAPL camps. There were a ton of champions who were a part of this big network of making this happen, who took part in all these different grassroots movements that were centered around land and water and climate. And I think all those moments played a big role in getting to where we are now. And of course, the thing, that I think was critical in some of those moments, thinking back to whether it's No DAPL or how people came together around Green New Deal, or all of these moments, and I also wrote down the Sunrise Movement. All of these elements were about building stronger relationships and building stronger networks, so that when this moment came, we could work better together. So yeah, definitely want to shout out, and that is where I am really situated in this work, is with the grassroots, particularly with Indigenous communities and tribes. So that's my vantage point, and getting our folks ready for this moment where we really needed to come together, and sometimes we agree, sometimes we don't, but find common ground so that when the time came, we could really act together, and that's what happened, and this is what we got. Of course, it's not perfect, and we'll get more into that, but I'm really proud of the work we did together.
Yeah, I'll take a slightly different approach. I agree with everything that's been said, but I'll approach it from a more political angle. The climate movement really matured politically in terms of its political organizing over the course of the previous decade. And what I mean by that is a few things. Number one, the youth climate movement and the Sunrise movement in particular, they took a slightly different approach, but an importantly different approach to organizing, which is that they really struck fear in the hearts of a lot of Democratic politicians. They were organizing and engaging in elections, not just in the substance of the matter, but in elections. And they pose a credible primary threat to a lot of Democrats. So for Democrats who weren't necessarily focused on this issue substantively, suddenly they were forced to. At the same time, the climate movement really matured when it came to the wealthy donor class in the business community. We had an enormous amount of money going into Democratic campaigns along with an insistence on climate action. And that doesn't sound like the nicest storyline necessarily, but it's incredibly important to how Washington, D.C. works. And so that was a big counterbalance force against the oil industry money, the coal industry money, that has historically captured many politicians in Washington, including some Democrats. It was not, those two factors were persuasive to the inevitability and the assistance of the Democratic Party as a whole taking action on climate, but also it was important at the end of the day to convince Senator Manchin, for whom those two variables, they weren't an influencing force on him because of his home state politics. So it was also true that at the end of the process, we had to take a different approach. But at the beginning of the process, the setup to the process, what made climate inevitable was that the politics really aligned on this issue like they had never done before.
Hey everybody, great to be with you. I agree with all the insights shared by my colleagues up here. A couple more. Just one, the circumstances to enable a real historical action like the 2021-2022 time period, the Inflation Reduction Act and the rest, were caused by a number of different factors. I'm going to speak to a few more in a sec, but critical is having elected leaders in place who, when the time is right, are going to prioritize making sure that all gets into the goal. And enough can't be said, because I don't think enough has been said, about the visionary leadership and the prioritization that President Biden put on placing this ball and getting major climate action over the finish line in 2021 and 2022. So again, I said it in particular because I don't know that it's been said often enough, but also not just President Biden, Senator Schumer, of course, House Democrats, Senate Democrats collectively, and really importantly, the staff, the hardworking and really, really smart staff who were on this panel here with me, who were there to make sure this got done. The circumstances are critical. The factors going into it to set the table are critical. Getting the thing done at the end of the day, when the chips are down, when the last vote isn't quite there, that relies on human power and senators and members and House and congressional staff. So I just want to say that. Okay, a couple of quick factors just to throw into the mix as well. Thinking of this like a stew. A lot of ingredients that went into this stew to make, let's say, IRA. One, big policy models that were trial run in the late aughts, in the ISA bill, 2007, 2009 Recovery Act. The actually Markey bill that didn't get over the finish line at the Senate. Went through the House, a lot of the policy was new, a lot of the politics. As Adrian mentioned, were new. A lot of the policy were kernels or seedlings that were first buried in the sand or in the soil 15 years ago, with tax incentives made more accessible for non-tax equity paying, non-taxable entities like federal financing tools like the Loan Programs Office. You think about the course of the last decade and the different innovations that were trial run in the movement and the state and local lawmakers. You think about, Adrian touched on this point, the expansion of the tent. It wasn't just about carbon pollution, it was about good union jobs. It was about environmental justice. It was about the tribal communities, the environmental justice, the black and brown communities that were hurt first and worst by pollution, by economic disinvestment, and as part of the solution set with what we're going to do now next. You look at the growth of the clean energy technology industry. We had a mature industry to fight for their future by the time 2021, 2022 rolled around in a way that maybe we didn't in the last legislative fights. You look at the leadership of state and local governments over the course of the last decade that trial run real policy solutions and showed a way of prioritizing this and getting over the finish line. Thinking in particular of the last 5 years of the last decade, 2015 to 2020, and especially the new Democratic governors that were elected in 2018 and the things that they started doing in 2019, 2020 that had this drumbeat of inevitability to it. Last 2 points. One is, and this has been the Green New Deal, the Sunrise Movement, and the central moral force that came like a meteor to hit the earth on right after the election in 2018, putting this squarely on Democratic leaders. Where's your plan? How are you going to prioritize this? And then it also just must be said, the crises, the four overlapping crises of 2020 with COVID, with the economic recession that caused the George Floyd murders, that you had this outpouring of, I think, elected officials and staff and average Americans who felt like something major had to get done. And I don't know enough has been said about that forcing function for policymakers. Like the president referred to as overlapping crises in his inaugural speech, and they really were, and they required an overlapping response, and that's what was delivered.
Yeah, well, shockingly, we're all friends and we all work together, so we probably mostly agree, although we'll get to points where we don't agree, which is okay too. That's actually why I love these people. It's okay to disagree with friends. You can still be friends if you don't have exactly the same opinion on every single subject. I think that's an important thing to remember in our movement. One thing I didn't hear you guys talk about as much was the primary. The fact that we had 28, I believe, Democrats running, and so much energy was poured in by frontline activists, by journalists, by academics to try to get the campaigns to create a kind of race to the top. And of course, Inslee's campaign was very critical to that, and Sam, along with his colleagues, wrote 200 pages of ideas, which were based off, as Sam was saying, earlier iterations that had happened in Congress. And meanwhile, you had Adrian and some of his colleagues in Senator Schumer's office as well, going through the historical bills that had been introduced and trying to think about, what is this actual agenda? So I think that race to the top that we saw during the primary was really important. Even something like, for example, the push to do a climate debate. I don't know if people remember this, but they said, we gotta have a climate debate. Why does it matter? Well, Democrats running for president have never been asked more than, are we gonna take away your hamburgers in a presidential debate before? And that's one question, it's a pretty bad one at that. But to actually have to spend 30 minutes talking about climate change, all of those candidates had to be prepped to do that to a depth that they never had been before. And I think actually getting politicians to get as deep on climate as they are every day on healthcare and social security and all the other issues is something that, and also as deep on environmental justice issues. And the fact that, for example, the White House created the Environmental Justice Advisory Council in part because of the energy coming out of the primary. I think that these are really important things to remember when we think about why we had momentum. Before I go to the next question, I do want to ask Adrian a follow-up. You sort of mentioned that the conditions that worked in the beginning, the ones that I think a lot of us are talking about, and I totally agree with what Jade said about no DAPL being absolutely critical. The Standing Rock protests were very critical at that time period. But you said that when it came time to actually finishing the negotiation, which you were on the front lines of doing, that because Manchin was the final vote, the conditions and the requirements sort of shifted. Do you want to speak a little bit about what changed then and what was the kind of thing you needed to actually get the bill over the finish line?
Sort of a less interesting answer, or maybe it's a more interesting answer, I don't know. It was really old-fashioned congressional negotiating, locking yourself in a room with somebody for months and months and their staff and building trust. That's how hard deals get cut. And it's human. It's a human exchange that if you don't have trust, then it fails. And if you do build trust, then you can lead this person to where you want to go, or it's a collective. Because ultimately, Joe Manchin didn't support or even know about many of the policies that were in the Inflation Reduction Act. But we had to build a sense of trust that whatever problem he had, anything he mentioned, anything he raised that was a concern, we were going to solve it for him. And that was hard, because that required making a lot of concessions on policies that we knew to be bad policy changes. But on the balance of the bill, the impact of the bill, we understood that we couldn't afford to not pass legislation. One of the things that I tried to sort of instill in the brain of Senator Schumer early in my tenure with him was that this was an issue that his North Star needed to be not about too much ideological purity on the policy solution. The North Star needed to be about maximizing emissions reductions with the votes that we have. And that's it. We wanted to solve for a lot of other things, but at the end of the day, for the majority leader, that needed to be his guiding light. And that didn't matter in the Build Back Better days or in the negotiations with Bernie Sanders or as the president listed all the things. Build Back Better plan was movement driven and really important, and that's what led to a lot of good policies that made the framework for the IRA. But in his final stage of the negotiation with Senator Manchin, that was what allowed him to be in that flexible mindset to be able to finish the negotiation.
I bet you people did find your answer interesting, am I right? Yeah, definitely. You are wrong. So the next question I'm going to ask Jade to answer first, and then we'll go that way and come back to Sonia. Obviously, this bill is imperfect. It is not every hope and wish and dream of all time. In fact, when we were negotiating the bill, I have a message that Sonia sent me at the time. She said, "This isn't a negotiation, it's a slow crushing of our dreams." You know that. In the end, our dreams mostly prevailed. But that is what high five. Not now. That was when the bill was dead. Remember those couple times when the bill was dead? Yeah, remember those moments? Those were very hard moments. Anyway, so that's not our vibe now. I'm not saying our vibe now. It's back in the day when we thought we would get nothing. But we did get a lot. It was not perfect. And of course, one bill is not going to solve injustice in this country, environmental racism in this country. It's not going to reduce every ton of carbon pollution that we're ever going to make. We all wish it would, but it, as Adrian just pointed out, the final decider was somebody who didn't necessarily share those values. So we need to pass another bill. We need to pass another series of bills. That's partially what we want to focus on today. And so I'd love to hear each of you, starting with Jade, sort of envisioning what is it that we left behind? What do we need to do either as a movement or legislatively? We can think about wonky side. We can think about more of the organizing political side. What comes next? What are the missing pieces? What are some of the holes, some of the things that we got wrong? What do we need to actually do in the post-IRA world, assuming that we don't descend into fascism? So Jade, why don't you take that one away? This is actual wood.
That's the first step and major front of mind for me right now. But I think just to focus on the communities that I serve and work with and work on behalf of tribes and indigenous communities. And we were actually just talking about this a few days ago, but there definitely needs to be more funding for tribes and indigenous communities. I think just getting right into the nitty-gritty, less competitive funding for tribes and indigenous communities. I have been, even before the bill passed, was just working on prepping indigenous organizations and tribes for what may come. Of course, we didn't know how much, to what extent, but we were fighting for something big. And we were trying to get groups ready. We were doing as much outreach and information sharing as we could. And that still wasn't enough for what we're going through right now, which is a lot of triage, a lot of supporting tribes, indigenous groups, really navigate each grant or opportunity as they come, and we're at a fire hydrant just getting totally blasted by all sorts of great opportunities. But when I'm on the ground, when I'm working in my own tribe, there are capacity issues, or gaps rather, challenges. And I think there's components of the bill that feel exciting so that we could potentially grow that capacity. One example of that is I've been really excited about the launch of the American Climate Corps. Anyways.
Changed names several times, so I wouldn't worry.
Yeah, Climate Corps. So in Indian country, in Native communities across the country, and even internationally, there's a big movement called the Land Back movement. Have you all heard of it? No. Great. Don't worry, we're not kicking you out. But it's about indigenous-led conservation. It's about indigenous leadership. It's about lots of things. It's about reparations, and I see a direct correlation between the American Climate Corps and the Land Back movement as an opportunity to bring more indigenous youth and people back into our communities to build capacity for the work that we still have ahead of us, which is a lot of work. And so in that way, I feel really excited in this moment, and I'm sure we're going to talk about what's next. But to address the gaps of capacity, I see that some of the other pieces of the bill can work in collaboration so that we can see the gaps and learn from what we're going through right now, and then build what we need as we continue to build on this. What else? I think for tribes and indigenous communities, I'll just make one last point. We need to make sure that there's less, or that maybe tribes, indigenous groups are lifted up in such a way where industry is not the one taking advantage of the opportunities. And that's what we're seeing a lot of right now. I think we need to have deeper and longer conversations around what it means to actually have good community benefit agreements and to uplift indigenous and tribal leadership and support them in navigating those types of partnerships and how to get in front of industry on some of these opportunities.
Thanks, Jade. Adrian.
We're supposed to answer this question in 3 minutes. That was our instructions. What are the gaps?
Totally fine on time.
What are the gaps in the IRA? There's so many gaps in the IRA. And that bill, I mean, first of all, it was flawed because of the negotiations. It was flawed because there were gaps in the policy development that was ready to move. It was constrained by a budget reconciliation process that is limiting the timeline of policy in most cases to 10 years, although we snuck in a few nuggets that go beyond the 10-year window. But most of it's constrained to that 10-year window. So it had a lot of limitations. It's not going to meet the president's 2030 climate target. Or at least we don't expect it to, according to the current modeling. And we would probably have to pass another IRA-sized bill in terms of emission reductions to meet our 2030 targets. So we're not just falling a little bit short, we're falling very short in every sector of the economy. And that's just to get our 2030 targets, to say nothing of all the decarbonization that we need to do beyond 2030, which is, it's only going to get harder because we're, in many cases, starting with the lowest hanging fruit in terms of the decarbonization challenge. I'm not going to talk about industrial because I know Sonia probably wants to talk about that one, but it's a big one. It's a big area where there's a big emissions gap. What I will highlight is that the thing that I get very nervous about, the single biggest subsector of emissions that will still be remaining in the economy, in the U.S. economy, is still light-duty vehicles. It's EVs are not actually getting us to where we need to go by 2030, according to current modeling. A lot of people assume, EVs are off to the races and they're going to get adopted without any additional policy, and that's just not true. And it's not true because of non-economic barriers. It's because of cultural and behavioral barriers to taking. Having consumers fundamentally make different decisions. It's one thing to get business that's very economically motivated to make economically rational decisions. It's a wholly different thing to persuade individual consumers who are not always motivated by what is most economically rational to change their behavior. And especially when climate has become as polarized an issue because of its partisan valence these days, and when EVs in particular are being railed against by the Republican presidential candidate, and wind turbines are too, but he's really focusing on EVs. And you can guess at why. The oil industry providing donations is probably a big reason, but that is pierced through the ethos of the Republican electorate, and so we're going to hit a real wall when it comes to it. I expect. I sort of hesitate to make projections like this, but I expect we're going to hit a real wall when it comes to EV deployment because of cultural and behavioral resistance to it. So yeah, we have to figure that one out. I don't have a solution to it.
Adrian's actually often a positive person, just not in this exact moment. Sam, it's your turn now. I guess we're doing the what's the problem holes question, so maybe it's a downer. I set it up, it's my fault, you're right.
Like everyone said, basically the economic regions, sectors, there's just tons more to do. We have tons more to do. I like Adrian said, I won't mention industrial decarbonization, although I would because I know Sonia's going to mention it. But also I was going to mention, frankly, housing reforms. We need denser, more livable, electric, green, transit-oriented housing, which is going to be some of the way of getting at some of the transportation emissions problem, some of the building sector emissions problem. Not to mention being an economic justice issue, it's going to sustain this this democracy we so cherish. And then fundamentally, I want to just go back to the power sector, which for a time after the IRA was passed, there was some kind of, hey, that's taken care of. A lot of investment, certainly plurality of the investment inside the IRA is in the electricity sector. And for a time, there was a moment of, okay, we've largely taken care of that. Well, the reality is, we look around, load growth is rising, as we expected it to, as more things electrify, as reindustrialization is happening with a domestic manufacturing capacity, especially these new clean technologies. Of course, the tech sector and AI and so forth, we've got load growth increasing, again, as expected, but we need to move even faster. We're running into barriers. Some of those are behavioral and utility boardrooms. They need to be moving faster towards clean electricity. Some of them are intrinsic to siting and permitting processes, the federal government level across and the state and local government level across the country. And a more concerted focus, obviously things were in the IRA also, like the electricity performance program or the electricity standards, siting and permitting reforms, transmission, interconnection reforms. It all comes back to electricity because that's how we're going to decarbonize everything else.
All right, Sonia, you're done. I think you might talk about industrial decarbonization. I've been told that twice.
I didn't know I had such a strong brand on that. So I want to just say first that the Inflation Reduction Act will triple the rate of decarbonization for the rest of this decade, which is already such an incredible accomplishment. So it is making an impact, and we are a lot lower in our projected emissions in 2030 than we would have been without it, right? When the president took office, we were headed for 25% reductions below 2005 levels in 2030. After this law, it's 40%. That's a huge change for something that's 350 weeks away from now or so. So 2030 is around the corner. We still can make a lot of progress, and we are making a lot more progress than we were before the passage of this law. So yes, it has holes, and there are lots of things that we all wanted to see in the final law that we're not able to get in there. But I think it's really important also to ground us in, my goodness, we are actually in a much better place than we were just a few years ago. I think I agree with everything that not surprisingly, I suppose, that everyone else here has said about where some of the further opportunities are on this stuff. I just want to, on Adrian's point about EVs, just the sophistication of the fossil fuel industry at this point. They know we are not just the annoying little, bug flying around anymore. This is a serious part of the American economy now. This is where energy writ large is going. Energy is such a core component of our national security, of our economy, and they want to continue to keep a hold on that, and on the politics, and on the policy, and on the debate, and on the intellectual debate. And so I think it's really important for us not only just to observe what is going on with the sophistication with which they are meeting the EV moment, but also what else it means for the rest of the sectors that we are all working on. And I guess I would say, as far as opportunities to continue the progress, I think the next push, we could talk a lot about continuing to make people's energy bills more affordable, to make energy more affordable for them. I think that is a way for us to also be able to get low-cost clean energy solutions to poor people who could use it the most, to actually have a little bit more breathing room. And it is true that there was a down payment on investments in decarbonizing our building sector in the Inflation Reduction Act, but we are not at the scale that we need to be at in terms of the resources that it will take to actually talk about getting pollution out of the building stock. And then, the other piece, which I can't not talk about because two people have not talked about it because they thought I was going to talk about it, is the fact that we are badly behind in the industrial sector in terms of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. So we're already at about a quarter of our emissions coming from that sector. And when I say industrial, I mean things like cement and steel and all the factories and making the stuff, chemicals that a lot of our modern society depends on, and making it now without releasing climate pollution or other types of pollution. And we kind of know how to do it, we kind of do, but we're still learning. And there was some really interesting programs in the Inflation Reduction Act to just sort of dip our toe into that water. But I think that it's going to be incredibly compelling as we start to see more and more and more of these factories opening up that are actually not creating a bunch of pollution and dumping it on the community right there, and yet nevertheless contribute millions in local tax revenue and create lots of good jobs right there, and all the economic benefit that comes along with all that. I think it's incredibly compelling, and what we need to do now is just really double down on making sure we get that to the scale that it needs to be so that we impact the emissions from the overall sector. Because if we don't start bringing that down, within a few years it'll be the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions of any sector here in the United States. It's already just about the same as a couple others. So the other ones are coming down, it's still not. So we're behind there.
Great. Well, yeah, I very much agree with what people say. I want to just highlight a couple things that were said. When Jade talked about sort of the competitive grants, I think it's a really good point. You know, there's sort of a limited pool of money that can be used for disadvantaged communities that are grants for tribes, right? And there's a more unlimited pool of money for more like corporations and wealthier people through tax credits. And of course, all of us would have liked more equity in the bill, but that is a really big issue. You know, we are getting closer to installing more clean technology in a more equitable way than we've ever been there before, but there's a limited pool of money for that. And steering as much of that limited pool towards actual disadvantaged communities through things like Justice 40 and going beyond Justice 40 is absolutely critical. But that money's going to run out, and hopefully we can spend it all too before we hypothetically lose it all. But I think that's a really important point. I also want to build on something that Sonia talked a little bit about, which is the building sector. We do have some things in the bill for tax credits for like the grant programs that flow through states for home electrification and efficiency. But it is a drop in the bucket when you look at how many buildings there are in this country. I think there's like 120 household units in 120 million household units in this country, and it's like we're gonna do like 2 million. Not enough. And then two of my passion projects, as Adrian knows, are schools. We basically did nothing on school electrification. We put a bunch of money into school buses, which is awesome. Love the school buses. Very charismatic megafauna of the climate decarbonization world. What about the buildings, man? Did you know that even in a rich state like California, there are some schools they don't have an HVAC system at all, let alone air conditioning? And we are starting through a heat pump, for example. We're starting to see entire school districts, like we saw in Pittsburgh last year, shut down because of heat waves. So this is a really important issue, especially in poor communities, that we have good quality ventilation, decarbonized school buildings. And then also affordable housing. Senator Schumer, that was his passion, and he got none of it, which is sort of tragic, not just for affordable housing, but also for Senator Schumer. And so we need to invest in making housing more affordable and making it clean and electric. That was a big part of the vision of the Green New Deal that we didn't really deliver on. And then finally, what Ricketts was saying about the power sector. We had all these debates. Many of us worked on the Clean Electricity Performance Program a lot. And people would tell us, Modeler, some of them, it doesn't matter. You don't really need it. If you just do the tax credits, the power sector will clean up on its own. Bada boom, bada bing. And because if the carrots are out there, the people will run and pick them up. Well, what we've seen is that several utilities, and I will name them, Duke, Southern, and the Tennessee Valley Authority, theoretically a federal entity, are not updating their plans at all. Their integrated resource plans remain the same as before the Inflation Reduction Act was passed, meaning they are still planning to build many gigawatts of gas. And that is not the economically best thing to do. It's simply in their own interests. For example, the Tennessee Valley Authority, the executive leadership, makes more money if they build a gas plant under current rules than if they build solar or wind. So that's what they plan to do, whether or not they're sticking the customers with a higher bill at the end of the day, let alone putting pollution into communities that have just managed to shut down a coal plant and don't need to be burdened with more pollution. So we have seen that a carrot is not enough, and that's what all of us thought at the time. It wasn't us who built the Clean Electricity Performance Program. So I really feel that we actually have to force utilities to move at the pace and scale that's necessary, that they don't seem to want to do it based on their own volition. So the last question I want to ask before we turn to a sort of closing remarks session is, I want to talk a little bit about our movement, the climate movement. And some of us have been more on the inside game, others have been more on the grassroots outside game, so we've had different positions over time and different positions across us as a group. But the climate movement, as we talked about, especially Jade in her opening remarks, was pretty cohesive, that we had common goals together, we were working together towards more environmental justice, towards more pollution reduction, and it was a really hopeful, almost utopian time if we think back to like 2018 and the resistance, for example, to Trump that really found its center in Standing Rock in 2016. And yet, in this moment that we find ourselves in the wake of the Inflation Reduction Act passing, there's a lot of fragmentation in our movement, and of course not everybody agrees with everybody else. As I've already mentioned, this panel is full of people who I can disagree with and still be very good friends with, and I adore you all for that. That's 10 out of 10 humans up here. But how can we as a movement build cohesion again? Because we talked about how we have to deliver more, that this is not enough. It is not enough for disadvantaged communities. It is not enough for pollution reduction. So how do we think about cohesion and unity as a movement going forward? Maybe not like tomorrow, because that'll be hard, but in the coming months and coming years, how do we make more progress? And I'm going to start with Jade again, because I am. So I'm sorry, Jade, you're going first. You get the easy question.
Okay, maybe we can turn this into like a dialogue a bit, because I'm sure I'll say stuff and then have thoughts after, but I mean, we all know, like, the sentiment that, like, well, I actually was watching Game of Thrones reruns a couple days ago, and it was like something, one of the houses was like, you know, the only thing that can bring down this house is ourselves. And this feels very true, like, to this movement, whatever we want to call it, like, the movement right now. I think what got in our way a couple of years ago and continues to be a challenge that we're working through and is coming like very like front and center right now is that we spent a lot of time critiquing the bad, which it is bad. Like we don't want false solutions, we don't want concessions to industry, et cetera, but we spent so much energy fighting the bad in the IRA, and speaking again from the vantage point I was working in at the time, grassroots, whatever, and we didn't celebrate the wins. And I always talk about this in my work, is like, we have to celebrate the wins, we have to be really vocal, we have to get into our communities. For me, going to tribal communities, indigenous communities, the grassroots organizations who are often very critical of federal agencies and federal work in general, and talk about the wins. Our focus on that so much over the course of the last however many years it's been since this past, I think is currently biting us in the foot, or whatever the saying is, right now, because, American sayings always trip me up.
I don't know what bites us in either.
Anyways, now we're at this point where, like, and I'll just say, like, the White House has a really bad comms problem right now, because we should be, like, shouting all these wins from every rooftop. We should be seeing, like, boom, boom, like, all the wins and all the money going to the communities and blah, blah, blah. All the things that you just named, like, those could be uplifted so much more. I just don't think, like, the average person knows, and that's a problem that I think, again, it's not just on the movement, but I think it's a problem that we can own and share collectively, that we needed to be more vocal, and now we're not seeing the hard work that we did and that so many people did leading up, since for decades, I would say, to get to where we are. It's just not there for us, and so we're overlooking all this win in a moment where it's most critical. And I forget who said it, but we need another one of these packages, and yet we're still like tripped up on the few bad things that came in with this one. So yeah, like I said, I'll probably add more, but that's my initial take.
Thanks, Jade. Adrian, you want to add?
Sure, yeah.
Newly back in the movement, out of the deep
Right.
basement of the Senate.
Yeah, and just to kind of define a little bit more what the fractures are in the movement, as Jade mentioned, the environmental justice community, many organizations rightly were very upset about some of the concessions made to Senator Manchin to get his vote at the end of the day. And so many environmental justice groups felt, they opposed, many of them, not all, but many of them opposed the IRA. But also a lot of them felt burned by the process, especially that phase of the process. And that was, they were right to feel burned. We tried earlier in the process to do a lot of work. I think that the outside groups did a lot of trust building, movement building work that was inclusive to the whole spectrum of the environmental movement, including environmental justice. And that was important. Setup at the end of the process was very divisive. And so right now we have the environmental justice community who is not aligned with the big greens, as they're often referred in terms of coming back together. The youth movement, the youth groups, Sunrise is also similarly in a different spot today than they were several years ago, and aren't engaging in the raw politics in quite the same way that they were in the run-up to the Build Back Better and the Inflation Reduction Act. And so the lack of youth elevation of climate as the priority one issue in the run-up to this election cycle is devastating to aligning the politics, having this be a priority issue for members of Congress and for the next administration. The business community is focused on implementation and making as much money as they can off this bill, and good on them on the one hand, but on the other hand, they're not now clamoring for pushing ambition even further as they were before. So those are the fractures that we see. Those are some of the fractures that we see. And we're victims of our own success broadly, politically, in that we just did this big climate thing and a lot of other big priorities got left behind. So we have a lot of work to do. And that work is, at the end of the day, movement building. It's people getting together and building coalitions that are founded on trust. But that takes a lot of work, and it's hard work.
Sam, what do you want to add here?
I'll be brief. Just enough the distinction, the very different feeling from now versus 2020 when groups were getting in a room together, environmental groups, environmental justice groups, labor unions, business voices, progressive groups, youth groups. There was an external force pushing them in the room together. Right? It was the president then. It was the crises that we're facing in the country. And we don't have that external force mechanism. We have what we've produced. We have our victories, and we have our semi-victories, and we have our recriminations against one another, what aren't quite victories yet. And we need, without that external forcing factor, we need to take it upon ourselves to get into those same rooms again. Everyone needs to be about that again. I mean, we got into those rooms because we had that external forcing function. We also got into those rooms because we had an interest in being in those rooms and we realized that we were all going to sink or swim together, and that recognition doesn't feel that recognition doesn't feel it's very much there. It's there again, it's staring us in the face, but that recognition of getting together, it has to be identified by ourselves.
I won't say much either because a lot has been said that I again agree with, but maybe just to get slightly existential for a second, there are cycles to movements, and oftentimes after a big step forward, it can take a little bit of time to reassemble and find those connections back because as everyone said in one way or another here, I think there is a feeling of holding someone's hand and trying to jump, and if you are getting through what is often a pretty ugly policy process in Washington, D.C. at the end of the day, it can just feel a little less close. And I think that is not unique to this effort. But I guess I would just, I think about this a lot. Unlike, other long-term social progressive movements, which, we want to solve all of those social issues immediately, of course. And there is like a relentless clock on this climate issue. And if we don't actually take another giant leap forward in time, it will have disastrous consequences for a very long time from now. And so what I try to reach for is how do we, knowing that this is a natural cycle and that it does take human beings putting themselves back in rooms and really trying to make connections with each other and figure out how to talk to one another and how to talk to other people about the importance of these things. How do we figure out how to do that just faster than anyone has ever done it before? Because we really got to get ourselves together here if we're gonna make the impact that I know so many people desperately want.
Yeah, sorry, Jade, you add. Go for it.
I was just gonna add to kind of like what can we do about this, or what is being done about this fracturing, or maybe like the tools or the tactics and the movement getting maybe tired or predictable. And since I know there's a lot of like institution people and coming from academia in the room, the Tishman Center at the New School is carrying out a fellowship called the Environmental Justice Movement Fellowship. It's about disrupting current or past strategies and tactics, and because Tishman is a design school, using methods of design or modules of design to look at the movement, assess like what's not working, why aren't we winning, how can we design new strategies, new tactics. So I think like more of those types of, I was in the first cohort, the second cohort is underway right now. And I think just more of those could be really beneficial to solving what we're all talking about here.
Yeah, well, I think that was really helpful. Certainly in the wake of the IRA passing, I thought a lot about this. One of my friends told me I should read Homage to Catalonia by George Orwell, which is about how the left fights itself and the fascists win, if you haven't read that one. Hopefully we don't end up there. I also have been really kind of thinking about sociology and what they have to say about social movements. And the thing is, when you pass a bill, right, when we think about the Green New Deal period or the DAPL period, right, like we're pushing against a common enemy, like I think what Sam was saying. And also we're imagining this sort of utopian vision. But then when Adrian ground down our dreams along with Senator Manchin, it's not your fault. It wasn't hypothetical anymore. It was real. And also, just like Adrian was saying, people didn't really understand what was in the bill. Senator Manchin being one of those people, but also, all across the movement. Even all of us who worked on the bill very deeply, there are still things I'm sure we're like, wow, that's interesting. Didn't really fully understand that. And of course, how the bill actually gets implemented changes what the bill does and doesn't do. So there is this point of ambiguity at the point of passage, which I've written a lot about in my research. But I think the thing I called that the fog of enactment. But what I didn't understand was that there's also like a fight that happens at the point of enactment. It's like the fight of enactment, because here's the thing, it's imperfect, it's a bill in the US Congress, you for it or against it. And I think that is just a fundamentally fractious thing to do, just like Sonia was saying. The problem is, we can't wait another decade to get back together. And I like to say that a fractured movement is the biggest gift to the fossil fuel industry. It doesn't aid any of our people and what we're trying to accomplish. It aids really our opponents. So we just have a couple minutes. So each of us can take 1 minute now to just, if there's anything we haven't said that you'd like to share with the audience, or a call to action. People love to ask climate panels. what can I do? Am I right? What can I do? What to be? Well, spend your life trying to change the world. That's one thing you can do, like these fabulous people. And I'm sure you're all doing that, and mwah, I love you all for that. So that's not the question. You don't have to answer that question. But what's a closing remark, Sam? You're going first. You'd like to leave people with.
I think I went a little long, and so my answer before.
You did not.
I'll just want to say thank you all for being part of this effort together. It takes a lot of work, a lot of late nights, a lot of long weekends, but it's gonna happen. So I appreciate you all being here and listening to this talk.
Adrian, you're up.
Well, that was very nice of you. That's not how it was meant, but thank you. The next phase of the problems in front of us on decarbonization, it's really granular. A lot of the barriers are granular. And so when I think about the call to action, it's never about like, what can I do in my life? Like, should I, you should put solar panels in your house, get an EV, but like, actually we need smart people like the folks in this room to start coming up with the policy ideas to address all these really granular barriers to decarbonization. And we're at a daunting but also exciting time in policy development where we actually need to, whereas before, in the run-up to Build Back Better in the IRA, we had the unfortunate luxury of, decade plus of policy ideas that were waiting to pass. We actually now need to have a whole bunch of new ideas to address known and in some cases lesser known barriers to decarbonization. So it's really helpful to have a lot of brains thinking about all the different challenges and coming up with innovative solutions and feeding those into the insane DC echo chamber sometimes that does gravitate around certain ideas and doesn't always have the most creativity in policy thinking. So I really encourage you all to spend some of your time and energy on that.
Jade.
Yeah, always climate work is like an all hands on deck effort, but especially right now, I think to my points earlier, just I feel like I work in a bubble. I feel like I often am like talking to my little bubble and vacuum, but you will come from different communities and sectors, and just go talk to people about like what we're talking about, the progress that's been made, and motivate people to care, and that exciting stuff is happening. I don't know if I can say this, but just go vote.
You can definitely say that. Go for it. Voting is important.
Okay, I think the only thing I might add is climate can sometimes be a little bit of a hard issue to get your arms around because it is so many issues and it's an all hands on deck thing. It's every single thing is affected by it, and so much of what we do in our daily lives affects it. That it can sort of feel like if you want to work on climate, you have to be at this like ethereal, theoretical level.
Gotta be a bodhisattva.
Or just like it's all like just this conceptual level kind of stuff. But I think we are very much in the part of the cycle on addressing climate change that requires people to be doing stuff and like actual practical stuff and taking all the theoretical things that we think about and just applying them as much as we can to something very specific and moving that specific thing forward. So, it doesn't mean that just if you decide you want to work on, how do you make fertilizer without producing a ton of greenhouse gas emissions, for example. You can still say you work on climate, because you don't have to just work on these theoretical and hypothetical high-level things. Like, that is working on climate, and in fact, that is very much what we need right now, is people who are picking a thing and moving that thing forward as fast as we can, learning the lessons of what works and what doesn't in that thing, and then scaling it, or changing the policy to make sure that we can scale it, or whatever the case may be. But that's really, I think, an exciting opportunity.
Yeah, Saul Griffith and Sam Kalish, who I work with at Rewiring America, counted up how many machines in this country run on fossil fuels, and it's 1 billion. That means that everybody gets to adopt at least 3 machines and electrify them, or find a different way to decarbonize them. And as Adrian was saying, it's not just in your own household. Think about, for example, food manufacturing, right, Sonia? A lot of that can be electrified. And for too long, the companies who said they want to do something about climate change have been counting. Spent a lot of time making spreadsheets and just counting how much emissions, We are past the point of counting, my friends. We have to actually change machines. We actually have to take fossil fuel machines and get rid of them and replace them with electric machines or with geothermal, my new favorite thing. We actually have to do things. That's what Sonia was saying. We have 1 billion machines and no time to waste. And I also want to point out what Adrian was saying. All of us made big impacts on policy. I'll say that I was pregnant while I was doing this. Sonia was basically too, and a lot of us are having babies. Sorry, Jade was fabulous too.
Quarter life crisis.
She's having a quarter life crisis during this. And all of us were just kind of people. We're not none of us are senators or very powerful or whatever, and we managed to make huge impacts and actually change policy. And so what Adrian is saying is very true. It doesn't have to be at the federal level. It can be at the local level, the county level, the state level. If you have a policy idea, go find somebody who wants to work with you on it, who's an elected official, and I bet you can take that thing way farther. I want to give a shout out to my friend Lee Wasserman, who just passed a law in Vermont, last week, to make polluters pay. And that was Lee grinding away for years to get that thing passed, trying to do it federally, and failing, poor guy, and he just started state, and maybe New York's going to do it next, right? All of you can actually be policy entrepreneurs. It is not some far-flung thing. All of us did it. We're not that fancy. So I just want to inspire you to go change as many machines as you can, whether that's through direct projects or through policy work. This is not some thing you can't reach. And with that, I want to say a big thank you to the Solana Institute for hosting all of us, and thank you to all of you for listening to us natter and get along up here. It was wonderful. Thank you for coming.